Chapter 17. Pop and the Weasel. Martha had contacts, although she never went out of her way to develop them. She knew the mayor, the mayor's secretary, librarians, store managers, motormen, policemen, delivery boys, and firemen. When Anne married and Ernestine at Smith, Martha took charge of the household when Mother was away on business, and she stretched the budget farther than it had ever gone before. Without spending any more money, she saw to it that each of us got a few more of the things he wanted. Mother ran the house in the same manner that she performed her schoolwork, effortlessly and efficiently, but without pretense of perfection. She saw to it that the necessary and important things got done, and she refused to allow the unnecessary or unimportant ones to cause her any concern. If she could settle for a B or a C in school subject, she saw no point in slaving for an A. Of course, if an A came naturally, and occasionally one did, so much the better. Likewise, if we swept and dusted the house in the mornings, she saw no reason to nag if we sometimes forgot to wipe our feet or hang up our overcoats when we got home from the school in the afternoon. Besides, sometimes she wasn't too careful about wiping her own feet or hanging up her own overcoat. Martha's contacts in Montclair made things easier for all of us. She'd get the grocer's delivery boy to stop by the hardware store to pick up something we had bought. She'd ask the men who drove the city snowplow if they'd mind taking a few minutes to clear our driveway. If Tom were sick, she'd get the milkman to help Frank and Bill carry the furnace ashes from the basement to the yard. People seemed to like doing things for her, and Martha didn't mind helping them. She knew whom to call if a street light was broken, or if the garbage man had forgotten to come by our block, or if a rabid dog was reported in the neighborhood. Mother and even the neighbors began to depend on her when they wanted something done by the town. Once, when Mother was out of town, a sleet storm broke the power lines, and the utility company said service could not be restored for 24 hours. Martha called the fire chief and asked him what to do. "With all the children we have in the house," she told him, "I thought it might be a fire hazard to have them stumbling around in the dark striking matches." A fire truck pulled into the driveway a few minutes later with 6 electric lanterns on loan to Martha. She had a thermos of coffee ready to send back to the station to the chief. Martha studied the budget periodically to discover just where the money went and to see if she could fix it so that less of it went there. If she couldn't figure out a way herself, she'd call the person who was getting the money and ask him. For instance, there was the matter of haircuts. As Martha pointed out, it was a relatively small item, but one that reoccurred. She telephoned the owner of the barber shop frequented by the boys and explained her problem. She told him that since we had 6 boys, we had to spend more money on haircuts than most families, and that it usually came to at least $3 a month. She wondered whether there was any way we could get a special rate, and if it wouldn't pay him to make us a rate, if he knew anybody who was just opening a shop and needed the business, who might be willing to do so. The barber said he had never given special rates before, but that he wouldn't mind doing it, providing the boys didn't come in on weekends or after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when business was heaviest. Money saved on transactions such as that was available for luxuries. If any of us wanted anything badly enough, and it didn't cost too much, Martha would try and get it and still keep within the budget. If she turned us down, we could always go to Mother, who usually would see that we did get what we wanted, whether the budget could afford it or not. But Martha, ordinarily easygoing, became furious when any of us worried Mother about money matters, and we found it was advisable, if we were to expect favors from Martha in the future, not to go over her head. Whenever possible, and if the price was right, we did business with the United Cigar Store, which gave out coupons and certificates with each sale. The cigar store had a catalog of premiums that included almost anything any of us wanted. There were such items as a genuine cowhide, jet black, positively guaranteed Big League catcher's mitt for 415 certificates. And the catalog said that in addition to the mitt, a regulation Big League baseball would be given away absolutely free for a limited time only to boys taking advantage of this amazing offer. 5 yellow coupons equaled 1 green certificate, and we kept them in separate cigar boxes on Martha's dresser. Every couple of weeks, she'd call us into her room and we'd count what we had, putting rubber bands around each 100 coupons and each 20 certificates, and then figuring how long we'd have to wait until we had enough of them to redeem. Tom was a chain smoker and usually bought his cigarettes by the pack at whatever store happened to be handy. He was continually running out of them and borrowing them from the men taking Mother's course, or smoking butts from the ashtrays. Martha started buying cartons of his brand at the United Cigar Store and leaving them in the pantry. Whenever Tom took a pack, he put an IOU in the carton and settled up with Martha on payday. "I never thought you'd try to make money off of me, like in a company store," he'd grumble as he paid his bill. But Martha pointed out that she was selling him the cigarettes at cost, and that he was saving money by getting the carton rate. All she wanted was the certificates. Tom really was pleased by the convenience of Martha's canteen, but went out of his way to check and recheck her edition and to question the authenticity of his IOUs. "That don't look like my writing," he'd say. "Where's the magnifying glass at?" Then, after he had paid with seeming reluctance and twice counted his change, he'd say, "Give me them IOUs so I can tear 'em up. I think some of those were the same ones you charged me for last week." Martha's students found out about the supply of smokes and began patronizing the pantry. Later, Martha started stocking razor blades, which was another item Tom usually forgot to buy. The first premium we obtained with certificates was a Mother's Day present, an ornate bedside lamp with a bright and dim switch. Mother used to say that Mother's Day was a ridiculous occasion, and that anyone who felt he had to give his female parent a special present one day a year must be trying to atone for 364 days of previous neglect. We thought, though, she was telling us that so we wouldn't feel bad because we could not afford presents. It took 650 certificates for the lamp. Mother seemed startled when we presented it to her, but when she found that we hadn't spent our allowances for it, or dipped into the budget, she was as pleased as if she had invented Mother's Day herself. "When I think of you children saving those certificates for months, just so you would have something to give me," she began. "You don't believe we're atoning for other days of neglect, do you, Mother?" Lillian asked her anxiously. "No, I don't think that, dear," said Mother, and her voice broke. "I know how long you've been saving those certificates and counting them at night, and well, I don't think there was anything to atone for." After that, we got the catcher's mitt, an electric toaster, ice skates and skis, a cigarette lighter for Tom, and finally, a bottle capper. Martha decided on the bottle capper so that the younger children could make their own soft drinks. The budget in the past had not been able to include root beer or ginger ale, but Martha knew that the children were fond of soda pop, and would like to have it in the icebox to serve their friends. It still was out of the question for us to buy soft drinks at a store, because a case would have disappeared in a single afternoon. But if the children could make their drinks at home, the cost would be negligible. Old gin, rye, White Rock, syrup, and bluing bottles were rounded up from neighborhood basements, washed thoroughly, and then boiled in a tub on the kitchen stove. Some of the labels wouldn't come off, but we figured the bottles were clean on the insides. Sugar was added to make root beer extract, which in turn was poured into a vat of simmering water. Then a little yeast was added, and the mixture poured into bottles. After the caps were applied, the bottles were stored in the basement for a week, and then they were ready to drink. The children thought, and so did their friends, that the root beer was the pure of any that came from the store. A new batch was made every couple weeks, and finally a sort of assembly line technique was developed, with 2 children washing bottles in the basement, 2 boiling bottles on the stove, and 2 mixing the brew. The empty bottles then were lined up around the stove, and the mixture siphoned into them through a rubber tube. We could make a couple hundred bottles of root beer in less than 40 minutes, and from that time on the basement always contained a batch that was ready to drink and another batch that was aging. Fortunately, Tom liked root beer, so there was no objections from him about dirtying up his kitchen. But as the weeks passed, he said he was getting mighty tired of the same old flavor. The next time we made root beer, he suggested we leave about a gallon of the mixture on the stove so he could change the flavor to his taste. Tom added a package of prunes, a cup of sugar, and a whole yeast cake to the brew. Then he boiled it for half an hour before siphoning it into the remaining bottles. "I'm putting my name in chalk on these here bottles," he said. "Don't nobody touch them, 'cause I don't know how it's going to turn out. I'm going to leave them stand for 6 months and see how the flavor is." "You're not going to try and make yourself some kind of home brew?" Frank wanted to know. "Who, me?" Tom said piously. "There's a law against that, ain't there?" Well, there was a law against it, all right. But after a day off in West Orange, Tom in the past had sometimes returned to the house, smelling strongly of something that wasn't root beer. Cousin Leora was not really a cousin, which was something to be thankful for. Her family and mother's had been close friends and neighbors in Oakland, and she had married and moved east about the same time that Mother had. She was plump, soft, bejeweled, and inquisitive. None of us liked her, and Dad had despised her. He said she was a bloated drone, and that if the both of us ever came over, which wouldn't surprise him, she would be at the top of their purge list. Cousin Leora's husband had wisely given up the ghost within a year of their wedding day. It was an action we felt sure he never regretted, although his worldly goods had been considerable. Left a widow with a sizable fortune which flowed through her fingers like flypaper, she lived by herself in an apartment in New York. Her visits to our house had become fairly frequent since Dad's death. Since she liked to quiz us about family affairs, she usually came when Mother was out of town. Invariably, she would arrive while we were eating supper, and almost invariably, it would happen to be the one night of the week when we were relying on leftovers. Once she had written Grocie, Mother's mother, in Oakland, that she doubted if we were getting enough to eat. As a result, Mother had had a series of anxious telephone calls from Grocie, asking if everything was all right and if we needed money. The calls had upset Mother so much that all of us tried to act particularly well-disciplined and well-fed when Cousin Leora came to call. A few months after we started to make our own root beer, Cousin Leora dropped in one night just as we had sat down to the table. Tom saw her chauffeurs wheel the limousine into our driveway and rushed to the dining room to spread the alarm. "Everybody quiet down and behave yourself," Tom shouted. "It's the fat old snoop from New York." "Not Cousin Leora," gasped Martha, clutching her head. "How could she know this is hash night?" "I think she likes my secret," Tom said proudly. "I believe the old snoop can smell my hash all the way across the Hudson." "Open some cans of vegetables," Martha hollered as she dashed to the front hall to hang up overcoats and kick Arctics and ice skates into a closet. "Everybody pick up his dishes and put on a Sunday tablecloth." Cousin Leora entered the hall without ringing the bell. "Why, look who's here," Martha cooed. "Cousin Leora, what a lovely surprise. I do hope you'll stay for supper." Cousin Leora would stay, she said, providing she wouldn't be depriving the dear children of their food. Martha took her things, and by the time they entered the dining room, the table was reset on a starched linen cloth. Mother had spoken that afternoon in Philadelphia, and still hadn't been home, but we were expecting her shortly, and Tom was keeping her dinner warm. Cousin Leora did not seem displeased by Mother's absence. In fact, we thought we detected a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "Your dear mother is hardly ever home any more, is she?" Cousin Leora began as Frank helped her into her chair. "She's here almost every day," Martha said. "She has her motion study course right here in the house, you know. I think this is the first time she's been away in a month or more." "I see," our guest nodded, setting in motion a series of chins which broke like waves on the expensive beachhead of her bosom. But she pursed her lips and made it plain she didn't believe a word of it. "I'm afraid," Martha stumbled, "we're having hash again tonight. You always seem to have the bad luck of picking a hash night." "Hash seems good to me after all the rich food we've been having," said Frank, trying to help out. There, dears," Cousin Leora comforted us. "You don't have to make excuses to me. I'm practically one of the family. I know things have been difficult since your father passed away." "Not that difficult," Martha smiled, weakly trying to remember that she must not act undisciplined. "We had roast pork last night, and the meatloaf the night before that." "I'm sure you did, dear," said Cousin Leora, pursing her lips again. "If she's sure we did," Fred whispered to Dan, "why did she make an ugly face like that?" Cousin Leora had good ears and didn't miss much. "Gentlemen, don't whisper at the table," she reproved Fred. "I said I was sure you did, and I was not aware that I had made an ugly face." "I'm sorry," Fred apologized. "But we did. Ask anybody." Martha wanted to side with Fred, but even more she wanted to prevent Mother being upset by any new telephone calls from California. "Whispering isn't polite, and Cousin Leora certainly wasn't making faces," she told Fred. "If you can't behave yourself, you'll have to leave the table and go up without your supper." "Oh, goodness, don't take the food away from the poor child," Cousin Leora protested, in a tone indicating our rations were so scanty that missing a meal might bring on pellagra. "Perhaps it would be better if we changed the subject. What do you hear from your grandmother, dear?" "She's just fine," said Martha. welcoming the change and clinging to it tenaciously. Yes, sir, just fine. Grocie is as fit as a fiddle, she sure is. I've known your grandmother ever since I was a little girl. She's a lovely person, isn't she? We certainly think so, Martha agreed. We certainly do. They don't make any sweeter than Grocie. And quite well off financially, isn't she? I suppose she's very generous? She sends us lovely presents, Martha nodded. But I know she must be generous in other ways, too. Generous in making things easier for your mother? She has certainly offered to make things easier, Martha nodded again. I thought she might have, Cousin Leora smirked. With 2 girls in college and this big household to run, I suppose your mother has had to rely on her rather heavily, hasn't she? I guess you mean, Martha said civilly as she could. Does Mother rely on her for money? Oh, of course, it's none of my business, Cousin Leora tittered nervously, but your mother is such a dear friend of mine. Fred leaned over when he thought no one was looking and whispered something else to Dan, this time so quietly that no one heard. I saw that, Cousin Leora snapped. What was that you said, young man? Nothing, I guess, Fred mumbled. I want to know what you said. Speak up. Do I have to tell her? Fred asked Mart. It's going to make her mad. Well, guess you better tell her. Martha nodded sympathetically. I said, Fred stuttered, looking at his plate, if you're such a good friend of Mother's, why don't you ask her? Dan decided to give Fred what moral support he could. He made up his mind that since Cousin Leora was already convinced that he didn't get enough to eat, he might as well give her something interesting to put in her letters to California. If Fred has to leave the table for whispering, Dan asked, can I have his hash? I've lost more weight than anyone else this year. Fred bared his teeth and growled in mock ferocity. If you touch it, I'll bite you, he snarled. Oh, goodness, said Cousin Leora. That's enough, boys, Martha warned sternly. If anybody gets the hash, I'm going to be the one. I'm the oldest, so I need the nourishment more than anyone else. We heard Mother coming up the front steps then and ran to meet her. Bill took her coat and hat, and Tom brought in her plate from the kitchen. Mother said her speech in Philadelphia had gone fine, and she was so glad this time not to have Miss Leora. I love hash, Mother announced enthusiastically, and partly for Tom's benefit as she sat down at the table. And I love to get home after a train ride. Well, what were you talking about when I came in? Nothing much, Martha put in hastily. Just chatter. As a matter of fact, Lily, Cousin Leora told Mother darkly, we were discussing whether this one, she pointed a diamond-studded finger at Fred, should leave the table. Why, Freddie, Mother said softly. What did you do, dear? I whispered, Fred admitted. I didn't think anybody was looking. It's not polite to whisper, Mother announced, relieved that the offense had not been something more serious. You know, when I was a girl and we whispered at the table, my father used to make us say it out loud. Sometimes, she laughed. It was mighty embarrassing, too. That's what Cousin Leora made me do, said Fred. This all sounded rather gay to Mother, not serious at all. And what were you whispering about? She asked, laughing again. Har-va-va-va-oomph, Cousin Leora cleared her throat noisily. Well, said Fred, she wanted to know if you got money. What group were you speaking to in Philadelphia, Lily dear? Cousin Leora interrupted. But Mother was listening to Fred. Who wanted to know if I got money, Freddie? Humph, 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 said Cousin Leora. Cousin Leora wanted to know if Grocie sent you money, and I whispered that if she wanted to know, she ought to ask you. Nobody said anything for a minute. Our guest looked as if she had swallowed some of her hash the wrong way, and Mother stared at her with something that was part wonder and part contempt. I'm going to answer your question, Leora, Mother said finally. I haven't been getting money from California. They have offered, of course, but so far I've been able to handle things by myself. And I think the worst of it is over. Cousin Leora glared defiantly. We knew she had never liked us, and now we knew she didn't like Mother either. You haven't been able to handle it, she spitefully spit out, when your children don't even get enough to eat. If she had sat down and rehearsed a speech from the day she had learned to talk, she could not have come up with anything that would have made Mother any angrier. But Mother decided to not lose her temper in front of her children. She felt with her foot around for the bell under the carpet, pressed it, and asked Tom to bring in the dessert. The left side of her mouth was twitching or trembling. We couldn't be sure which. It was the first time we had ever seen it act that way. Tom came in, heavy-laden with a tray of chocolate blancmange. Perhaps it was the vibration of his footsteps. Perhaps it was just chance. At any rate, there was a booming, house-shaking roar in the basement, followed by a metallic ping as something hit the basement ceiling directly below us. Cousin Leora jumped out of her chair in terror, and even Mother dropped her fork. "Earthquake!" croaked Leora, who had been through the San Francisco one, and much louder, "Earthquake!" There was 4 more window-rattling roars, each followed by a ping, and we heard something flowing and dripping down below us. "Listen to that," said Tom. "It ain't no earthquake. It ain't nothing to get excited about." "What in the world is it?" Mother demanded sharply. "It ain't nothing but the children's beer," he assured her. "Mercy, Maud," sighed Mother. "It gave me a start." "The children's what?" shrieked Cousin Leora. "Did he say the children's beer?" "Root beer," Mother explained, and the left side of her mouth was vibrating again. "They make it themselves." "Root beer," said the visitor, edging toward the hall. "Doesn't explode. Only something with alcohol in it explodes. I don't think it's safe in here." She opened the door to the hall, and an unmistakable aroma of alcohol permeated the dining room. "So you even let your children do that, have you?" she called over her shoulder as she went to get her wraps. She grabbed them and started for the front door. "I'm going to write your mother about you, Lily Gilbreth." The door slammed and 2 more bottles exploded. We heard gravel spatter as the limousine rolled out of the driveway. Mother was simply furious. Psychologist and doctor of philosophy she might be, but now, just for once, both her psychology and her philosophy deserted her. "Let her go ahead and write then," Mother mumbled. "See if I care. My folks have more sense than to believe anything like that. Let her go ahead and write a whole book. See if I care." "Don't let her upset you, ma'am," said Tom. "She ain't nothing but a fat old snoop." "Fat old snoop," Mother repeated, as if that's what she had been looking for. "Fat old. She glared at Tom, who started nervously dealing out the blanc mange. "Let's hear from you," she said, and we had never heard her talk like that before. "Where did that alcohol smell come from?" "All right, ma'am," Tom conceded, and he was gaping like the rest of us. "It must have been one of them bottles I put prunes in. Just to change the flavor, of course." She asked Tom to step into the kitchen with her, and she closed the door behind her, but we could hear the rise and fall of her voice, and we heard Tom sob and go up the back steps toward the attic where his room was. When Mother returned, she was pale and shaking. She was not furious anymore. "I had to do it," she said. "I had to let him go. I know how you feel about him, but that's simply the last straw. I have enough on my mind when I leave you children alone without worrying about something like that." No one felt much like eating, dessert, or talking. We knew it was Mother's decision to make, and we didn't blame her, but we thought there was an empty place in the house without Tom. He didn't have many things to pack, and pretty soon we heard him come downstairs again and descend into the basement. Mother looked around the table miserably, but we avoided her glance. "I told him to get rid of those bottles with the prunes in them before he left," she explained. We still didn't say anything. "After he gets rid of the bottles," Mother sighed, "you go down there, Frank, and ask him if he wants his job back. Tell him that once, just this once, I've changed my mind."